very generous, down-to-earth man. Anyway, a few years ago, I was asked by Radar to do a piece on LGBT history, and I chose Lou. And so I'm going to read that. I'm better at reading than I am at speaking extemporaneously, so I'm going to read that. It's about Lou, of course. And what happened was, even though I knew him, like a lot of people, I went and read through some of his archived journals, particularly in 1975 through 77, when he was living in this area. Interestingly enough, I ended up living in this area about 78, 79. Anyway, when I talk about in pre-transition, I'll be using he, but I'll also indicate that it was when he was still female. And I have changed the names of people in his journals for privacy. It's almost impossible for young trans men embarking on transition today to imagine what it was like in the late 80s. At the risk of sounding like a toothless grandpa running my gums about the kids these days, I have to make this clear. When I began my transition in 1989, we only had one newsletter, one support group with quarterly meetings, and only, to my knowledge, one F to M memoir, Emergence, about a former nun who became a happily married man and was even wed in the Catholic Church to a virgin, which is what he said in the book. There was one decent movie, so this wasn't somebody I could identify with as well. There was one decent movie, What Sex Am I? That film was informative, but it also featured hospital music and an omniscient narrator whose tone of voice was eerie and grave, as though she were describing very tragic and sick people who should be admired for their courage, but also viewed with a restrained, muted pity. In fact, the entire decade of the 80s was mostly a wasteland for positive transsexual visibility and activism. Janice Raymond had published The Transsexual Empire in 1979, a virulently anti-transsexual text that essentially claimed that trans women were the mutilated products of a mad medical conspiracy to strengthen traditional sex roles by creating a race of bionic Stepford wives. Yeah, she really believed that. Trans men were tokens and dupes of the patriarchy. She wanted to, quote, morally mandate transsexuality out of existence. And then there was Lou Sullivan. It is no exaggeration to say that without Lou Sullivan, the entire trans male emergence and renaissance that we are now experiencing here in San Francisco and around the world might never have happened. Or possibly it was due to happen, it had to happen, and Lou was simply selected by fate as the most skilled, determined, fluent, and passionate transmitter of the FTM experience. The one to break through. Lou Sullivan was incredibly important as a conduit of information and a harbinger of change. Not only did he begin the historic group that I attended, FTM, and founded the newsletter with Kevin Horowitz, but after being denied testosterone because he wanted to be a gay man, he lobbied and worked to change the gatekeeping conventions for medical transition so that gay trans men could obtain hormones and surgery. This change alone opened up the world of possibility not only for trans men who are gay, but also eventually for all trans men who do not conform to rigid stereotypes about gender roles. Louis Graydon Sullivan was born Sheila Jean Sullivan on June 16, 1951, and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in a large, closely knit Irish Catholic family. Sullivan once joked to me that his given name, Sheila, was a drag queen name. A self-taught writer and historian, Lou worked most of his life in various office jobs, often as a typist. He moved to San Francisco with his longtime boyfriend to be close to the heart of the gay male community. When he arrived, he reports that there were 100 gay bars. Lou identified for many years as a female transvestite. However, while he cross-dressed often when going to gay bars, or even at work, meaning formal men's clothing, suits and ties and dress shoes, not unisex clothing like jeans or t-shirts, Lou often yearned for the completion that hormones and surgery promised. Reading his journals from 1975 to 76, I found myself caught up in his internal conflicts as he attempted to live successfully as female and have relationships with men that were, at least in fantasy, those of a gay man. He met with varying degrees of support. His boyfriend often called him Louis and enjoyed his cross-dressing, and was shocked to see him trying to wear dresses once in an attempt to become more female. The androgyny and sexual freedom that was prevalent in the 60s into the 70s provided a context for Lou to experiment with gender role play, usually with androgynous men who were otherwise mainly heterosexual. He was named after Lou Reed. From the perspective of the queer trans community of 2010, when I wrote this in San Francisco, Lou Sullivan remains an unlikely progenitor. He was never, ever a lesbian or dyke, although he both feigned and sincerely explored an interest in bisexuality, both to satisfy his curiosity and to meet like-minded masculine women. When I read his journals, I feel as though I am watching someone in an odd bubble, one that is mostly free from the influence of radical or lesbian feminism. Today, many of the most visible trans men come out of queer studies or women's studies and are dyke-identified before they begin medical transition, and often even before they become gay men. Many potential or latent FTMs in the 80s and 70s were buried in the lesbian community, believing that a desire to embody manhood was a vestige of self-hate and patriarchal oppression. Being a dyke provided a way to exist in the world outside of a normative female gender role, but it also locked us into another kind of female world and role and demonized masculinity and men. Lou was in another place altogether. He was, to the world, ostensibly a straight woman, a fact that caused him some degree of awkward discomfort as he navigated the gay world. Even so, he found acceptance often and worked on a gay publication in Milwaukee when he was pre-transition. He also experienced fag baiting as Sheila and was harassed on more than one occasion while cross-dressed. Sheila writes in his journal after an incident with boys who shot at him with squirt guns and called him fag. I'm glad I passed and love to be thought of as a fag, but really. Lou's encounters with the world of 70s feminism was also often ironic and hostile. He writes about going to a bisexual woman's rap group in 1976 while still Sheila to, quote, get more in touch with women to help dispel all my bad opinions of them. I was apprehensive but open. And then, believe it or not, incredibly, this can't really be happening. The group turns out to be the members of this women's switchboard group. They are debating whether this one person, who they can't decide is female or male, who said she's a TB or some futuristic in-between sex, should be allowed to participate in their women's center activities. And basically, whether TB or TS should even be allowed there. What fate. I just couldn't believe my ears. The age-old lesbian feminist versus TVs, or transvestite. Unfortunately, there were also man-hating conversations throughout some bisexual group. So I sure felt like a sore thumb there in my suit, and finally I spoke out. Can I say something? Speaking as a female transvestite, I'm sick and tired of seeing transvestites and transsexuals being shit on by feminists. And so, the gauntlet was thrown. The fact that Lou loved men would both hold him back in transitioning, since he would be refused admission to gender programs because he wanted to be a gay man, but it would also propel him forward. While certainly aware that women often get the short end of the stick, Lou was not filled with rage against men or the patriarchy. He did not come into transition like so many trans men today, announcing his extreme and deep dislike of men and his intention to not actually be a, quote, man, even after transition, or to, quote, buy into a binary that privileges men or maleness. He never used the term male privilege, although I think he was aware of it. Lou Sullivan, in other words, really liked men, and he was not at all apologetic about his preference for men and masculinity. His adoration of male beauty provided a portal for him to slip into a male identity. His relative indifference to women and his lack of need for their approval also carried him forward. He never fit, so he could never betray the lesbian, the feminist, or queer women's world. He both desired men and wanted to embody their appeal. He felt that male beauty was superior, and even wrote in anger about a female stylist who, quote, butchered the hair of a man he loved, explaining that, quote, she chopped off his lovely thick curls. How could she possibly do that to him? It's like female revenge on superior male beauty, end of quote. Like many of us here in San Francisco, Lou felt that his sex fantasies telegraphed a unique and potent magic, a skeleton key that would open his most closely held and essential identity, and they certainly did. Before transition, while he was struggling to claim his male identity and still feeling as though he had to live as female, he wrote of the man he desired, quote, the old slave master fantasy still held, and I was Andrew, captured and being taken off to be sold. And on the ship over, each of the men raped me several times. Beautiful, beautiful Andrew. Though there were women captured also, none of them compared in the least to Andrew's beauty. The men caressed him, he excited them. I could switch back and forth. I would love more than anything to enter his small virgin ass like that, to force my way in and then inhale the fragrance of his hair, lick the back of his neck, caress his chest and shoulders, and come inside him, clutching him in ecstasy. My beauty, Andrew. End quote. Later, after a long struggle to be Sheila and to deny his male self, Lou goes to a movie about Valentino, played by Rudolf Nureyev, and is caught up in his internal dream of masculinity and desire. Quote, I walked out of the movie theater after seeing Valentino, and I was Nureyev. I looked like him. I had his face. I was confused in the same way he was. I holed myself up in my apartment the rest of the day, haunted by it. My fantasy creeps through me with little fingers that won't let go, and I haven't figured out how to placate it, end quote. Of course, Lou would transition soon after that. He would open that abiding and recurring dream and walk inside of it, eventually enabling so many trans men who came after him to inhabit our desires and dreams of maleness, to become men, even if, unlike him, we feel the need to apologize